Picture this. You wake up tomorrow morning and check your phone. Your bank balance looks exactly the same, but something feels off. Coffee costs more. Gas quietly jumped again. That grocery bill hits like a parking ticket you forgot about. The news calls it temporary volatility. Politicians assure you it's under control. But deep down, you know this isn't just random inflation. It feels like you're watching an empire's expiration date being printed in real time. If any of that sounds even slightly familiar, hit subscribe now. Because once you understand how reserve currencies rise and fall, you'll never look at your paycheck, savings, or strong dollar headlines the same way again. Here's the uncomfortable truth nobody in power likes to say out loud. Every single dominant currency in history has walked the same path from glory to graveyard. Rome's silver denarius, the Dutch guilder, the British pound sterling. Each one started with hard trust, grew drunk on power, then collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. And right now, the US dollar is strutting through stage 3 of this 7-stage death march, absolutely convinced that this time is different. Spoiler, it never is. So let's walk through financial history's greatest train wrecks. From the rise of trust all the way down to mathematical collapse. Because understanding this pattern isn't some nerdy trivia exercise. It's survival knowledge for anyone who doesn't want their life savings to end up as a punchline in a documentary 50 years from now. 7 stages. 1 inevitable ending. And America currently playing the lead role in humanity's latest experiment with economic gravity. Stage 7 is where every reserve currency fairy tale begins. The rise of trust. This is when the magic trick gets built. Not the fun kind of magic. The kind that convinces entire civilizations their money is immortal. Rome was an early master of this illusion. Their silver denarius wasn't just a coin, it was a 3-continent flex. Each piece of metal screamed law, order, and tax collection from Britain to Egypt. Merchants in Africa, Asia, and Europe accepted Roman silver without thinking twice, because it carried high silver content and the promise of an empire that looked unbeatable. Fast forward a millennium, and the Dutch pick up the torch. By the 1600s, Amsterdam is the world's financial nerve center. The Dutch guilder is everywhere. It's like having the only streaming service on Earth, and it actually works. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, revolutionizes trust by guaranteeing deposits in full silver value. For over a century, that promise feels unbreakable. But trust is a drug. Once you get hooked on global confidence, you can't live without it. The Dutch quietly start lending out more reserves than they actually hold. A polite way of saying they discovered leverage and creative bookkeeping. Still, the world believes, because belief, not gold, is what turns a local currency into a global one. Then Britain steps up. The pound sterling rules the 1800s like a financial emperor, backed by gold, trade routes, and a navy that can erase entire rivals from the map. By 1913, roughly half of global trade is invoiced in pounds. London is the planet's bank. Everyone else is just renting credit. The pattern is always the same. Trust grows, spreads, and eventually feels permanent. Once you're the world's favorite currency, everyone wants your money. Everyone depends on your system. And every empire, from Rome to London to Washington, becomes convinced that their monetary dominance marks the end of history. But trust always has an expiry date. And when that confidence starts to crack, empires don't just lose money. They start losing their minds. Stage 6 is where the story gets louder. The age of excess. When money thinks it's bulletproof. If Stage 7 builds trust, Stage 6 weaponizes hubris. This is when empires start confusing a lucky run with divine right. The Dutch, high on trade profits and colonial plunder, convince themselves the guilder can fund supremacy forever. They build the first modern stock market, invent corporate finance centuries before Wall Street, and essentially prototype capitalism as we know it. Underneath all that brilliance sits a quiet rot. By the 1700s, the Dutch are living more off financial trickery than physical trade power. Their currency stays strong on paper, while their geopolitical position weakens in real life. The British look at this playbook and say, "We can do it bigger." Throughout the 1800s, the pound dominates global finance through pure imperial swagger. London controls the world's money supply. Major transactions from New York to Bombay flow through British banks. But empire burns cash like rocket fuel. The cost of defending far-flung territories, projecting power, and playing global referee bleeds treasuries dry faster than tax collectors can refill them. 2 world wars later, Britain is buried in debt, and its supremacy evaporates faster than its colonies can print independence flags. Enter the United States. Fresh, industrial, and absolutely certain it's the main character. In 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement formally crowns the U.S. dollar as the new global reserve currency. It's backed by gold, unmatched industrial capacity, and America's control of the majority of the world's monetary reserves. For a while, it is genuinely glorious. The dollar is rock solid. The middle class booms. Highways, suburbs, and washing machines spread like confetti. But the same old disease creeps in. By the 1960s, America is trying to finance the Vietnam War, the space race, and an expanding buffet of domestic programs. All at the same time, all on credit. The country starts living beyond its means, propped up by the dangerous fantasy that the dollar can never fall because everyone needs it. When France's Charles de Gaulle sends a warship to New York in the 1960s asking to swap dollars for gold, it isn't just pettiness. It's a warning shot. People are starting to wonder whether America has printed more promises than it can actually back. Nixon's 1971 move to end dollar convertibility to gold isn't just a temporary measure. It's a quiet default on the original deal. Translation: we can't keep this gold-backed charade going. From that moment on, the dollar stops being a claim on something real and becomes a pure confidence game, backed by military power, network effects, and branding. And the markets celebrate. Credit expands. Suburbs spread further. Wall Street discovers something they like even more than money: leverage. Every reserve currency hits this inflection point. The moment it stops primarily creating real value and starts primarily consuming it. From Dutch guilder to British pound to American dollar, excess becomes the bridge between greatness and decline. It's the late-night party when the champagne still flows, and the music is still loud, but the floorboards are quietly cracking. Stage 5 is the hangover, the debt spiral. The party that keeps going because no one dares turn on the lights. This is where governments get hooked on borrowing. The tax base isn't enough. Real productivity growth slows, but lifestyle expectations, military commitments, and political promises keep climbing. So they reach for the credit card. For the Dutch in the 1700s, this was war-financed reality. Endless conflicts with England and France drained the treasury. To maintain the appearance of strength, they borrowed aggressively. The Bank of Amsterdam, once a byword for prudence, slowly turned into a confidence game built on IOUs and creative accounting. When Napoleon's troops showed up in 1795, the illusion shattered. The guilder's credibility went with it. Britain didn't learn much from that cautionary tale. After World War I, its debt load was enormous, bigger than anything its empire could realistically support. London tried to pretend the pound was as solid as ever, but a lot of the gold was gone, pledged, or sitting in vaults in New York. Post-Vietnam America enters its own version of this phase. The 1970s bring stagflation, slow growth plus rising prices, something economists had to invent a new word for because "we messed up" didn't look good in journals. Debt balloons, productivity growth sputters, and inflation quietly taxes everyone with a savings account. Instead of getting tighter with money, Washington leans into the printing press. The 2008 crisis hits, and the solution is to borrow and print trillions to rescue the financial system. Then the pandemic arrives, and the response makes 2008 look conservative. By the 2020s, U.S. federal debt crosses $30 trillion, and nobody in charge even pretends there's a plan to reverse it. Modern monetary theory arrives as the intellectual cover, whispering that deficits maybe don't matter as much as everyone thought, as long as inflation stays under control. The problem is that inflation doesn't ask economists for permission. A debt spiral feeds on itself. You borrow to spend. You spend to keep growth alive. You need growth to justify more borrowing. Interest piles up even if rates are low. Trust slowly erodes. And suddenly a massive chunk of your national budget goes just to paying interest on yesterday's promises. When a reserve currency's prosperity depends more on its ability to borrow and print than on its ability to produce, the collapse countdown isn't theoretical anymore. It's just a matter of timing. Stage 4 is less dramatic, but just as lethal. The decline of production. The slow forgetting of how to make real things. By this point, the empire's factories are quieter, its ports less dominant, and its people more addicted to comfort than competition. This stage doesn't look like collapse. It looks like convenience. The Dutch started here when they shifted from dominating physical trade to dominating financial transactions. They were still rich, but increasingly as middlemen instead of makers. Britain followed the same script. The world's workshop gradually outsourced more and more production while keeping the financial plumbing in London. America's version kicks into gear in the late 20th century. The country that once mass-produced cars, steel, and electronics starts shipping manufacturing jobs overseas. Made in USA becomes more of a premium marketing label than a baseline reality. The economy tilts towards services, finance, software, consulting, advertising, entertainment, layers of abstraction stacked on top of a shrinking industrial base. Why build a factory when you can build financial products on top of other financial products? Why make something tangible when you can trade derivatives tied to bets about other derivatives? Every declining reserve currency makes the same mistake. It starts mistaking paper wealth for real wealth. Stock markets hit records, GDP numbers look decent, asset prices soar, and the middle class gets told that they're investors now. Meanwhile, infrastructure ages, wages fall behind the real cost of living, and inequality stretches wider. By the 2010s, America's trade deficit is a permanent feature, not a temporary glitch. Imports consistently outweigh exports. The strong dollar keeps foreign goods cheap, which makes consumers feel richer than they are, but quietly hollowing out domestic production further. The decline of production isn't just an economic story. It's cultural. Societies that once celebrated builders, engineers, and craftsmen start celebrating influencers, speculators, and financial engineers. Long-term thinking gets replaced with quarter-to-quarter earnings and trending topics. At this stage, the empire doesn't collapse outwardly. It quietly loses the ability to stand on its own without external credit and imported goods. Which brings us to stage 3. Where the U.S. arguably sits right now, the cost of defense. Protecting an increasingly fragile system with overwhelming firepower. When an empire stops being the world's best producer, it often tries to stay the world's biggest enforcer. The less convincing your economic story becomes, the more tempting it is to lean on your military story instead. Rome spent massive chunks of its budget maintaining legions spread across 3 continents. Over time, the cost of payrolls, supplies, and frontier defense crushed the treasury. To keep paying the soldiers, emperors debased the coinage. Less silver, more cheap metal. Inflation followed, trust evaporated, and internal fractures widened. The British Empire repeated this pattern with a navy instead of legions. At its height, the Royal Navy consumed a huge share of public spending. After 2 world wars, Britain was financially exhausted. The empire fell apart even as London tried to pretend it still mattered on every map. Today, The United States spends more on its military than the next several countries combined, with bases and operations spanning much of the planet. Hundreds of installations, global fleets, and permanent security commitments form a network that is impressive on a map and eye-watering on a balance sheet. The justification sounds familiar. Our currency is strong because our military guarantees global stability. Our military is strong because our currency can pay for it. It's a loop that works until it doesn't. History's verdict is blunt. Once a reserve currency needs massive, constant military presence to sustain its financial status, the underlying economic strength is already fading. The legions, fleets, and drones are symptoms of insecurity, not raw dominance. By the time you need hard power to defend your money's soft power, you're no longer running on productivity and trust. You're running on momentum and fear. And that leads straight into stage 2, the currency war. When admiration turns into exit planning. Stage 2 is when the rest of the world starts quietly looking for the exits. Your currency is still the default option, but it's no longer everyone's first choice. When the British pound began slipping after World War I, the U.S. saw an opening. Its economy was healthier, its gold reserves larger, its factories booming. By 1944, Bretton Woods formally anointed the dollar as the new anchor. Ironically, America now finds itself on the other side of that dynamic. As U.S. debts expand and domestic politics fracture, rivals begin building alternatives. China pushes more trade in yuan. The BRICS countries explore payment systems that bypass the dollar. Central banks steadily accumulate gold again. Europe experiments with digital alternatives. The U.S. responds with a toolkit that every aging empire eventually reaches for: sanctions, tariffs, currency pressure, financial blacklists. Using the dollar's central role to punish enemies and pressure allies may feel powerful in the moment, but it also teaches the rest of the world a simple lesson: dependence is dangerous. The more the dollar is used as a weapon, the stronger the incentive for other nations to build escape routes. What starts as dominance ends as resentment. Countries don't stop using your currency overnight. They quietly reduce exposure bit by bit, year after year, until one day the system no longer revolves around you. This is the paradox of currency war. The harder you fight to keep your status, the more you signal that you're afraid of losing it. Stage 1 is the part no empire believes in until it's too late: the collapse. When math finally beats story, collapse doesn't arrive with a single headline. There's no big red button that says, "This is the moment." It shows up as a slow, grinding loss of confidence, punctuated by sudden shocks. Rome's money died by debasement. By the 3rd century, imperial coins contained so little silver that people stopped trusting them altogether. Local economies reverted to barter, regional currencies, or whatever hard assets they could find. Tax collection broke down. The empire fractured. The Dutch guilder's downfall came when the French invaded, and the world realized the Bank of Amsterdam's gold reserves were a lot more story than substance. What had looked unshakable turned out to be leverage and illusions. The British pound's long fade was sealed after World War II. Britain was functionally bankrupt and dependent on American loans. Within a generation, sterling went from king of currencies to just another local unit of account. Each empire told itself the same comforting narrative. We're too central, too advanced, too integrated to truly collapse. Each one underestimated the simple truth that confidence is everything, and once it's gone, it rarely comes back. The US dollar still dominates almost every major chart that matters: trade, reserves, debt markets. But all the classic late-stage symptoms are visible at the same time: structurally rising debt, political paralysis, persistent deficits, growing inequality, a financial sector overshadowing real production, and a world quietly experimenting with alternatives. When the real turning point comes, it likely won't look like movie-style chaos. It will look like irrelevance. A world where major deals no longer default to dollars. Where central banks hold less U.S. debt. Where America's ability to export inflation and import goods on credit shrinks year after year. Just like the Dutch, just like the British, different soundtrack, same movie. And here's the most twisted part. Collapse is never the end. It's just a baton pass. When one reserve currency dies, another rises to take its place. Built on similar promises destined for a similar arc, humanity doesn't quit the game. We just reboot it with new logos and slightly updated excuses. Look at a dollar bill. "In God we trust" sits right there on the paper, which is darkly poetic when you realize trust, not divine intervention, is the only real backing left. Empires never recognize their final acts while they're living them. They mistake inertia for immortality. The Dutch believed the guilder would stay supreme. The British assumed the pound and the empire were inseparable. Americans talk about the dollar as if it's the final boss of economic history. History doesn't share that confidence. Every sign of late-stage decline is already visible. Dependence on debt, shrinking industrial base, expanding defense costs, weaponized finance, widening inequality disguised under averages. The US dollar is still in charge, but if you look at the pattern, it fits somewhere between the debt spiral, the decline of production, and the currency war, with the cost of defense already towering over everything. That's not 3 steps away from collapse. That's 3 stages into a process that has never once reversed once it picked up momentum. This doesn't mean America vanishes tomorrow or your dollars become toilet paper next week. It means the world will, sooner or later, move on. Maybe to a new dominant currency. Maybe to a basket. Maybe to some hybrid system we haven't built yet. But it will move. Because we don't actually learn from these cycles. We just rename them. If you want to understand the future of money, don't obsess over next week's stock chart or the latest speech from a central banker. Pay attention to the pattern and to your own behavior. Every collapse in history starts with a crowd confidently repeating the exact same line. This time is different. It never is. So that's the 7-stage cycle. How empires earn the world's trust, leverage it to the max, and eventually grind that trust into dust. The pattern doesn't change. Only the currency codes and the flags on the charts do. If you don't want to learn this lesson the hard way through your own bank account, hit subscribe. We're going to keep unpacking the financial illusions that run your daily life, so you can at least see the trap before you step into it. Because the next reserve currency collapse is already somewhere on the calendar. The only real question is whether you'll recognize the pattern before everyone else does.